Hi. I'm outside of the Ashram that Franklin Merrell-Wolff built. And how I became connected with him, how I had any kind of relationship or interaction with him, came about from a very real and deep excursion into consciousness for me this lifetime. It was in 1976, and I was at home by myself, living in a small house in Stonewall, Manitoba, 340 2nd Street East, which isn't there anymore. It's been torn down, but that's another story. But anyway, as I was in my kitchen, for some unknown reason, or at least for whatever reason was necessary at that point, consciousness began spiraling inward for me, deeper and deeper and deeper. And it was very easy, effortless for this to be happening. I didn't do anything in particular. I don't think I was doing anything unusual. I wasn't taking any psychedelic or any other kinds of reminding factors at the time. But this spiral inward led me to recognize something about this process. And I recognized that if I went much further, that I would at that point encounter what to Homo sapiens is known as death. And so at that junction, at that point of transition, as it were, I decided that I needed to know more about mind, that I really did need to know more about mind and consciousness. And so I went from there. I suddenly had a very deep urge to see my parents, a very loving feeling of wanting to see them for some reason. I'm not sure what the exact feeling was. It was one of kind of an encompassing, positive kind of, I don't know, embrace of lovingness. Anyway, I drove the 20 miles or so between the little town I lived in and their town. And when I got there, I found them not home. It was a beautiful, sunshiny day, late in the evening, before sunset. And when I saw that they weren't home, I just went out the door, went down the street, and walked over to this very new convenience store that had just opened up about a block and a half away from my parents' home. And so, without thinking, really, I walked through the door of that store, saw a book rack, the kind that's got a kind of a circular display on it. My hand spun the rack around, literally, and without looking, practically speaking, without looking, my arm shot out, found this book, kind of a pale blue, sky blue colored book, pulled it out, and looked at it. It said, Pathways Through to Space, something about a personal journal or description of transformation of consciousness. I said, this is it. And I went back, and that's how I connected with Franklin Merrell-Wolff, whom I consider to be, out of all the amazing enlightened beings that I've had the very great privilege of meeting in my lifetime, in my odyssey on this plane of existence and on this small planet, I consider him to be my first teacher, my first true spiritual teacher, in the sense that I went home and I immediately decided that I would read Pathways Through to Space without missing a word, that I had to understand absolutely everything as clearly and as directly as possible. And I did just that. I've never read a work like that in that way, with that kind of intensity, with that kind of intention. I may have read other works afterwards with that kind of intention and intensity, but that was unique in terms of I read everything, and if I didn't understand, I would define it. I would find out what everything meant, and I wouldn't go on until I understood everything in that work up to that point and before it. And that's how I continued to read it. And I found that eventually that work, Pathways Through to Space, became like the root, as someone recently mentioned, of all the other teachings I've ever encountered. Because Franklin Merrell-Wolff was connected to the deep non-dualistic teaching of Shankara, who is one of the major founders of Advaita Vedanta. He was one of the main people who afterward was contacted by many of the tantric Tibetan Buddhist teachers because of the depth of his teaching and how closely his descriptions resonated with teachings on shunyata, the Buddhist version of what's called emptiness, and the void, if you will, and the clear light. Those kinds of direct experiential recordings of his awakening experience that Franklin Merrell-Wolff knew before he wrote it. He knew at the beginning, at the departure point or the entry point of his journey through into the higher, deeper and deeper levels and higher realms of conscious understanding in terms of what a human is capable of. Those he understood before he actually wrote. And so Pathways Through to Space is still one of the greatest books on conscious transformation and the transformation of consciousness that's ever been written and ever will be written, because anyone who reads it will understand that you are not reading about someone. You are reading about yourself going through what Franklin Merrell-Wolff went through. And if you do happen to have the opportunity to do this, read his book, because it will transform you. That's all I can tell you. But that's how I met Franklin Merrell-Wolff, and many years went by, and I did communicate with him. And he did send me his second book after Pathways Through to Space, called Philosophy of Consciousness Without an Object. But what he really meant was Philosophy of Consciousness Without a Subject and Without an Object, which is what he defined in the book itself. And so the book was just published as that, Philosophy of Consciousness Without an Object, but it means more than that. It meant that what he was really dealing with was beyond the subjective, objective kind of plane, not beyond the object-oriented universe and then the pure subjective. That there is that which is beyond that, and even beyond that there is whatever, nothing really. Nothing we can describe in words, the nameless, the void of the void. There have been many attempts, but few of us have really succeeded in transmitting what we're really attempting to describe in words what is indescribable. It's indescribable what we're attempting, and yet it's inherent, immanent, it's omnipresent, it's present and transcendent at the same time. It's a co-emergent, transcendent immanence. And what we're attempting to do is to transmit the untransmittable. But if you have an opportunity to check out anything by Franklin Merrell-Wolff, and check out the Great Space Center webpage, I think it's on Facebook and elsewhere, I believe, do so. It's well worth your time as a human, as a being in existence itself, to check out what Franklin Merrell-Wolff was getting on about in terms of he wasn't getting on about anything. He was trying to reveal something that is obviously with us, always. And so I leave with that at the moment. I'm visiting the Great Space Center, which is far below, and the sanctuary is in the cleft of the mountains. Mount Whitney is the highest peak in the United States, in the lower 48 United States. And it is a magnificent location for this ashram that Franklin Merrell-Wolff introduced, and what he wished to provide for those who were travelers, voyagers on their odyssey through existence. It's a center of peace, and it's a center of true wisdom and understanding. And if you can make the journey, it's not an easy one getting up here, by the way, but if you can make the journey, do so to appreciate the efforts that have been made so far, and maybe help in continuing to make the efforts that will continue to be needed in as long as human beings exist. This ashram was built not for just a momentary personal kind of following. Franklin Merrell-Wolff understood that. It's not about him, it's about the consciousness. What he calls the high indifference, what I call impartial equanimity, love, whatever you wish to call it, shunyata. There are many terms for it. To be in that nirvikalpa samadhi, that is the whole point of just being alive. And yet, because we become embroiled in our conditioning as a human in terms of all the survival dictations that are constantly bombarding us, we forget that we're infinitely more. Infinitely more. Just for starters, than all that survival, rabble, ruckus, and everything else that's connected to it. So please, if you can, make that journey and help contribute to widening and deepening the peace and the genuine love, compassion, and awakening that Franklin Merrell-Wolff intended for all of us to realize. Thanks. This is